So today we're going to talk about Matthew 25 and about the reading from 2 Samuel. And a number of people have come up to me and they've said, I've never heard this reading. Where did it come from? Like, is this really part of our lectionary? And I will tell you, it's not part of our lectionary. You don't hear it because we have not included it in our yearly readings. So think about that as we talk about what the meaning or one meaning of Matthew 25 is, and who are those people who are imprisoned? Who are those people that we make invisible and don't see? Matthew 25:37, however, the parable of the sheep and the goats, is one of those Bible texts that many of us can almost rattle off. We know it by heart. We've heard it so often. We talk about it because we're people of caring and of justice. The scene itself takes place in Jerusalem toward the end of the gospel as Jesus is talking to his followers, to his disciples. And he's explaining to them, this is what's going to happen when I come back. This is what's going to happen in the future. Some commentaries say, in fact, this is what's happening now. I have brought this new world to you. But it might also be that this is the world that we look forward to. And this is what's going to happen. So the parable he tells is ripe with statements of justice and of moral theology. Jesus lays out key elements of the Christian world in which compassion and justice are central engines, or the central engine of behavior and belief. They are what set us on fire. They are what we listen to and follow as Christians. And so he says to them, or the king, Jesus in his future self, says to his followers in the parable, "Come, those blessed of my Abba, inherit the realm prepared for you all from the foundations of the world. For I was hungry, and you all gave me food. I was thirsty, and you all gave me drink. A stranger, and you all gathered me in. Naked, and you clothed me. In prison, and you visited me there. You visited me, though I was imprisoned." And Jesus' followers in the parable listen, and they ask, well, when did this happen? We don't remember seeing you. Where were you in prison? Where were you when we were feeding the hungry? And Jesus answers, as much as you all did for one of the least of these my kindred, you all did it to me. You all did it for me. I was there in prison. I was hungry. I needed clothing. I needed welcome. And you gave it to me because I am in my people. So in a few lines, Jesus outlines the attributes of our moral operating system as Christians. We must care for and put at the center of our lives the well-being of those who are naked or sick or imprisoned. He invites us to take this on as a community. Notice he has that southern way of speaking. Jesus says, y'all do this. You all, as in you all gave me food. As much as y'all did for one of the least of these, my kindred, y'all did it for me, all of us. We are embraced by Jesus at this second coming, or this quasi-second coming, or we are damned by the values of our society. That y'all means us as a community. What are our beliefs? How do we behave? What are our actions toward other people? And so we are embraced by Jesus, or we're damned because of the actions of our communities, not just because of our personal behavior. And so this is a call to each of us to gather with one another, to come together in a desire for welcome, compassion, and justice. And I understand compassion and welcome. Compassion means seeing the pain and need of the other and acting to relieve that suffering. Welcome is acting toward the stranger as if that stranger, that person who is new to you is already a member of your community, that you care for them as if they were one of you. You reach out to them or you accept their coming and speaking to you. But justice, what is justice? Justice is so much more complicated, I think. And it has become politically loaded. It has become a politically loaded term, appropriated by politicians and pundits. Really, even theologians can't agree on what it means. In one modern understanding, however, justice relates to God's relationship to the world and God's desire to see creation restored to sinlessness. So to see us made whole, to see the world cleansed of the things it has done to each other and made whole again. And God's justice, and this is key, God's justice is revealed in Jesus. It is revealed in Jesus Christ, and Christ's work, Jesus' work, reveals that true justice is formed by charity and that its rule is mercy. So to understand justice, we look at how Jesus behaved. What did he say? And we might then go back to Matthew and say, what is justice? What is how we should behave as shown in that passage? So justice is not simply something we seek for ourselves. I've been acted against, this is not right. But an attitude toward how we treat each other. Our concerns about racial justice, economic justice, gender justice, social justice, all spring from this root. How do we care for each other? How do we find balance and oneness and acceptance for all the people around us? So this morning, I'd like to sharpen our attention to situations that may not be as obvious as hunger or illness. Our compassion, our community's need for justice are also challenged by suffering that is often invisible to us, by suffering that acts as a ghost in our midst that we do not see because it is silent and it is not spoken about. And recognizing these ghosts can be difficult. And so we may need to listen carefully to things that make us uncomfortable, to things we don't want to think about, because we don't talk about them in our society, so that we can change and so that we can respond with compassion and with justice. And so here's where I say I'm beating around the bush, because really what this is all coming back to is the rape of Tamar. And I found this morning's reading of her rape by her brother deeply disturbing. And if any of you has been raped, or if any of you has a child, a sister, a loved one who has been sexually molested and remains traumatized by that, you have my entire heart. The women in my family have been physically abused. One of them was raped as a young girl. And I, like my daughter and most women I know, in fact, have been jeered at in the street, felt up by strangers in elevators, and mocked in the workplace because I'm female. And in my experience, that is what happens to women in our society. It's when in your 20s and 30s, it's everywhere. You can't escape it. Later on, it becomes more subtle. Rape and misogyny create trauma for our entire society, and that poison infects women of every class and social status. And yet, as I said, we don't talk about it. Women are still imprisoned by shame, denial, and a patriarchal belief that boys will be boys. And for every Gen Zer willing to share her story of abuse on social media, there is, or to say Me Too, there is a rape trial that belittles the experience of women who have been violated in their bodies and in their souls. So no wonder women are ashamed by the violence done to us and are imprisoned by our trauma. It is an old story that remains young. 50% of American women and almost a third of men will experience some form of sexual violence in their lifetime. 50%. 25%, 1 in 4 women, will either be raped or will thwart a rape and escape. This sin against women and society is so pervasive as to be almost unimaginable. And yet, it doesn't get talked about. It doesn't get talked about in our lectionary. We heard it last week, but even there we don't always talk about Bathsheba being raped. And Tamar's story contains many of the elements of rapes that occur in the modern world. It is laid out very specifically and very concretely. Tamar is raped at her home by her own half-brother, so a member of her family. Her father, King David, pretends nothing has happened. In fact, he sends her on to her brother. Take care of him. But he doesn't pay attention to it later because he says, oh, well, I love my son so much. I'm not going to protect my daughter. She's causing problems for me. And you may have heard that in stories today. Well, it was her fault. She brought it on. The only immediate consequences are for Tamar, who will live as a pariah and a social outcast for the rest of her life. She tells her rapist that his scorn and sending her away is worse than the actual act of violence itself, because she will be imprisoned forever by his actions, invisible now to the world as a human being. She is imprisoned as surely as as those whom we visit in physical prisons. What is our response to the sin of sexual violence? I think that first we recognize that it is a sin that doesn't simply violate other people's wives and daughters. Odds are high that it has happened to women in this room. We need to open ourselves in compassion to hearing of the trauma of others around us, if they are willing to share, if it feels safe to them, and to embrace them if that is what they wish. In the parable of sheep and goats, Jesus tells us to stop blaming the victims. Instead, feed them in the prisons. And yet we blame the victims of rape so often. Well, she asked for it. She brought it on. She was wearing a miniskirt. And he says, no, you can't do that. We need to call out behavior, abusive behavior and sexist talk. You've heard the cliches. It was only locker room talk. It was just a joke. Lighten up. And boys will be boys. These feeble excuses do not cut it as responses to a sin against not God and our neighbors. And we keep in mind Jesus' call for God's justice in the parable of the goats and the sheep. When Jesus returns, he will ask us as a community, what did you do for the least of these? Where were you when these women were molested or raped? Amen.